Hey everyone. So the first aspect of the everyday BEETZ model regarding coaching and leading is the term brokering. That's what this discussion today will be about the brokering aspect of everyday BEETZ. Again, the word everyday is a key one here with this model. The model emerges from about the past 10 years of work that I've done with some colleagues on leadership in complex environments. So this was not all done in a coaching environment. A lot of this was done in community-based organizations, in schools, in higher education organizations, and learning about how does leadership best unfold in places where there are a great number of complexities, not kind of simple organizations, but complex ones. So that these aspects of the BEETZ model are some of the kind of key principles we've learned as being often present in some of the most high-performing places. So the first aspect of that we'll talk about regarding coaching is brokering, and that's what this discussion is about. As you can see, the other models, the other aspects of the model will be discussed at another time. To broker here, that's a term that we've heard a lot in different ways, but to broker here, I am referring to the act of connecting. So to broker is to connect. So when we talk about coaching, how do coaches make connections, recognize connections, foster connections? That kind of thing is what we're talking about. But I want to be kind of specific in it today. I want to talk about three specific ways that I think about brokering with regard to this BEETZ model, and will encourage you to think about them. First of all, coaches shape their team's connections. I'll say it one more time. Coaches shape their team's connections, and I'll say what I mean by that. Coaches can diagnose and shape the networks that are on their teams. Coaches enter existing networks on their teams as important actors. So let me say what I mean by that. So when we talk about coaching players, we're not really necessarily talking about just coaching individuals. Of course we do that. Of course we work on developing skill sets of individuals. We work on like getting individuals to kind of gain knowledge and to increase their understanding of a game that we coach. But the more fundamental, the deeper work of coaching is focused not just on individuals, but on networks of people on our teams. And not just like the team as one. That, of course, is where we're hoping to get. We're hoping to get to one team that is kind of moving forward with a unity of purpose. But just about every team has these kind of sub-networks within it. And so one of the key challenges of brokering that we're talking about for coaches is to diagnose what are those networks on a team. There are a lot of networks on most teams, and they're made up around a variety of variables, and we'll talk about that here in a moment. Another kind of aspect of this that we should keep in mind is that when we are in the role of a coach or an administrator or leader, we can help engender what we could call network closure. We're coming into places that already have networks established, or those on our team. Everyone who comes onto our teams or is a member of our team, they have a network. They have a network of people that are on the team, that are off the team. They have a network of people who are affecting their lives. We need to kind of understand those networks a bit better as coaches, and to kind of figure out how we can bring them together in really positive ways. This picture here comes from in the field of research. There's kind of a field of work called network analysis. Network analysis. There's kind of a bunch of really advanced kind of statistical ways that we can diagnose networks in organizations in any group setting. And I'm not going to get into all of that. That's not the intent here. But these kind of simple visuals show us like the difference between what we would call like a closed network and an open network. If you look at each of the little circles here, the lines, think of each circle as a person, and the line between each circle as a relationship between people. So look at the difference between the closed network on the left and the more open network on the right. The closed network is one where everybody is kind of in the same kind of broader network, right? They're all kind of tied together in one way. They're not all directly tied to each other. If you see, some of the circles are not connected to other circles, but there are no major kind of fracture points in that network. There are no major kind of isolation groups on that network. Now, if you look in the other network, and you see kind of three distinct kind of clumps of groups. Some of them are kind of isolated from the others. So the network on the right is actually much more common that we'll find on a lot of teams, that we'll find a lot of kind of little cliques on teams or little groups. And these groups take shape around a variety of variables. Sometimes they take shape around, for example, grade level. So if you're coaching a high school, say you're coaching let's stick at the college level. Let's say you're coaching a college soccer team, and the seniors, tend to be with the seniors, and the freshmen tend to be with the freshmen, and the other class is somewhat the same. That's one natural grouping that we find on most teams. Most teams will have some sort of clustering around grade level. There are also other variables, obviously, like clusters around race or ethnicity, clusters around position that someone plays on a team. So, like, obviously, football is an obvious example here that the offensive players and the defensive players are largely separated in practice and in the way that they interact throughout a given week, and even by position. So if you're a receiver, you may not necessarily be interacting as much with the offensive lineman as you do with other receivers. Another division we often see is around playing time. So sometimes clusters or networks develop on a team around those who are kind of the key players and those who could be considered like reserves or role players, those who don't kind of get in the mix as much. And that actually can be has a potential for being a more not as healthy of a subgroup, that those types of groupings. No one of these subgroups is inherently problematic, and I don't think my point here is not to say that we should have no subgroups on our teams. The point is to say that it does become problematic when subgroups become isolated from one another, and they don't understand each other, they don't know each other as well as they might. So when we talk about coaches, a first act of brokering might be to diagnose networks, to see where the kind of fracture points are, and then to say, well, how might I best or we best work to kind of bring closure to this network where we don't have this isolation, but we're all kind of together. I'm sure that a lot of you, if you think about your team now that you're a part of, or a team that you have recently been a part of, you could reflect upon those networks on that team, and you could think about some really productive networks, and you could probably think about some more dysfunctional networks or points of isolation on teams that were that kind of undercut the larger work of the coach or the work of the team more broadly. So that's difficult work. This is some of the key work of coaching, is diagnosing these networks and trying to bring some sort of closure to them. Again, let me reiterate one aspect of that and give one example. So what I'm not saying is that everybody on a team needs to know each other equally well, and that everybody needs to interact equally, or everybody needs to get along just perfectly together. What I'm saying is sometimes you can identify one or two or three key individuals who, if they are brought together, they might be in disparate groups. If those couple or few individuals somehow are brought together in new or different ways, even simple ways, it can have bigger implications for the larger network. So that diagnostic work of coaches is more nuanced than just saying let's bring everybody together. It's saying like maybe there are key leverage points. Maybe if you look at some of these diagrams here, you could see someone in group 2, one person who might be brought together with one person in group 4 or group 3, and just by nature of fostering that connection, the larger group will come together naturally. That's diagnostic work. And one example I would share, I know there are many examples that many of you could bring up, was that when I was in graduate school and I worked at the University of Utah with the kind of the academic component of the athletic department, and I worked with the football team at Utah, and the Coach Meyer was the coach there. Coach Urban Meyer was the coach, and he had some really specific strategies that he used at that time. This was a long time ago, to bring these networks together. He would purposefully, for example, even at meals, he would pair, members of the team who are in different classes together. He would pair members of the team who, different kind of racial or geographic backgrounds. He would pair different people in different position groups together. And not only would he pair them, but he had specific instructions for them when they had meals or when they interacted. They had to learn about each other, and he would even quiz them, about each other's backgrounds then. And in some ways it seemed, I didn't immediately get it when I was witnessing it, or I was, in those rooms, but you ultimately over the long haul could see these disparate networks, these open networks closing, and everyone getting to know each other better because of the strategic way those groups were shaped. That was an act of brokering. That's just an example of this first act of brokering, which is that coaches shape their team's connections. So a second aspect of brokering, remember I'm going to talk about three of them today, is that coaches impact who or what team members get connected to as a result of being part of the team. All right, that's a lot of words. I'll say it one more time. Coaches impact who or what team members get connected to as a result of being on the team. I'm going to share some examples here. And they're not sports examples first. I'll share some sports examples afterward. But there's a book that I have often referred to that is called Unanticipated Gains. And it is a book about child care centers. It's a study by Mario Small, a professor who went and studied all these places where people would drop their kids and for child care. And if you think about that, if any of you have children, or one day will have children, and you think about you want to drop your child at a child care center, why would you do that? You would do it for one obvious reason. The obvious reason is that you want kind of a safe place for the kids to be, and that at the end of the day, you go get them and they're okay, they're doing fine, and it's a consistent, safe place for them to be, a good place for them to be. But he studied all of these places, and he found that at some of these child care centers, you got not just that safe place and healthy, good place for the kids to be. They got more. They got what, just like the title of the book, unanticipated things, unanticipated gains. They got more than they bargained for. And he said largely those unanticipated gains were kind of relational connections. Like some examples were that at some of these child care centers were places where mothers would meet other mothers and they would develop friendships. Or mothers would get information about further learning opportunities for their kids or for them because some of these centers were really good about having information stored and presented to them. So I go drop my child off and I learn, there's a community college or a 2-year college down the street that is offering classes. I can work toward my degree. There were some of these child care centers that had job postings, so they had places where a mom could, or a dad, mostly these were mothers, but there were both moms and dads, where they could learn about jobs in the community and get employment Some of them were places where people could learn about, places of worship in a community where they could go and be welcomed in new ways. So, none of those are things that you would go to a child care center explicitly for. You're going there to take your kid there, but because some of these places were so smart and so effectively run, people were getting more than they bargained for. They were having a richer life experience at those places. They got unanticipated gains. So some organizations, some leaders, and I'll say some coaches are really good about this. They're really good about saying, we're here for one purpose. Like in the context of coaching, it's to, again, I come from a basketball background. It's to learn to become a better basketball player and to win basketball games and to have a good basketball experience. It's centered around basketball. But maybe there's more. Maybe there's more that someone, if I'm a coach, that someone on my team gets. They don't just get the great basketball experience. Maybe they get a lot more. Maybe there are unanticipated gains from being a part of that team. Here are a couple examples. One is not a sport example. It's of a friend of mine's barber shop in Madison, and it's called JPHD. Jeff Patterson is the barber that you see there in the picture. And why do you go to any barber shop? You go to any barber shop to get a haircut. It's a very specific thing that you're looking for. It's a service. Most people aren't. There's no ambiguity about why you go to a barber shop. You go there to get a haircut. Well, in JP's place, if you go to his shop, you get a lot more than a haircut. You get a connection to an entire community that he has established there. Like the child care centers that I mentioned, he has information on the walls. He has opportunities for lots of things that you learn about there. In his shop, he has what he calls a men's health and education center. So if you go to JP's shop, you can actually even get like a medical checkup. You can get tested for blood tests or screening. And he has doctors that come in and through there. He has recognized a need in the community and said, well, people are coming to me anyway, and let's make it a great experience. Let's get them more than they bargained for. Let's get them unanticipated gains. And a lot of it is based on relationships. So if you go to the shop, you get a haircut from JP, but then you also tend to get to know a lot of people. There's a lot of recurring customers, and it's almost like a family environment there, where he's designed his shop purposefully to make connections. The way it's laid out, the way that the rules of the shop, all of those things. He's a broker. He's not just a barber. He's a broker. He shapes connections. He forges connections. If you go there, you get more than you bargained for. If you check out their website, you'll know more of what I mean by that. This is a video of one other thing that he does. Is he has even a little web series called JP Behind the Chair, and he does little YouTube videos about like information that people can be useful to people in the community. So he interviews business leaders, he interviews church leaders, he interviews politicians. Here in this picture, he's interviewing an athlete, Wesley Matthews, who plays in the NBA, and he grew up going to the shop there, and so he's sharing information with the community as well. So he's brokering. JP is a great example of a broker, of delivering more than one bargains for when you go there. So an example in sports, again, I would like you to think through any examples of coaches who are like that. Coaches who don't just, by nature of being on their team, you learn skill, you learn to be a teammate, you learn all of those things that are centered on sport. But think about coaches who have delivered more. They've delivered life connections to people and ideas and things that have been important to you. As with most of these things, it can also go in a negative way. Like some coaches, by nature of who they are and what they do, you forge negative connections. You forge connections with people who are not healthy for you. You forge connections with ways of being that are not good. So this this can go either way. I mean, I think we need to be. This is why I want to consciously talk about this. This is a picture of some Vanderbilt student athletes. One thing that Vanderbilt has done is very purposefully thought about this idea of brokering and connecting. That if you go to that university as an athlete, as a student athlete, you will, again, you get the athletic experience, but they are talking about what else will you get connected to. So this is a picture from on Martin Luther King Day a while back. They took a group of the student athletes. They chartered a plane and they flew there, and they took a really special trip where they visited the African American History Museum and a number of other things. And they were connected to this life-altering opportunity where it wasn't just about sport. It was about learning about the civil rights history in our country, and it was about connecting them to being good citizens and ideas about that and people who were centered on that. It was a really great example of brokering by their athletic director and coaches there who attended with them. Another thing that they did, this is just an example of talking about Vanderbilt, they have what they call Equality Weekend in recent years in February, where for example, the basketball players would get connected with a local civil rights leader over the course of a week or a month, and they would spend time with that person. And in one of the games on one of the weekends, they even have special uniforms that they wear, and they wear that civil rights leader's name on their back instead of their own. They wear the name of the civil rights leader on their jersey. And it's another just a really great example of a concrete connection to something bigger than just basketball, bigger than just their sport. That's brokering practice. That's what we're talking about. So that point number 2 is that coaches impact who or what their team members get connected to as a result of being on the team. Who do I get? So as a coach, that's a really, I think, an important question. By the way we shape things, what do people get connected to? Okay, so the last aspect of brokering I like to refer to, the first one again, the first one is coaches shape the actual networks on their teams. The second is that coaches impact what people on the team get connected to in terms of people, resources, and that kind of thing. And then the third aspect of brokering is that I think this is the foundational one, and this one may be a little tougher to grasp, but I think it's what underlies all of these other things, and actually much of the whole practice of coaching, which is at a foundational level, coaches lead the way in shaping what it means to be a part of this team. Let's talk about that for a minute. So everything we know about collective action in organizations, which is something that I study about, how do organizations come to work together, or groups of people come to work together well. One of the kind of baseline things is people have to have a certain meaning. They have to understand why they're doing it. It has to be a meaningful thing to them if they're going to be consistent and cohesive. I'll give a little example of this. My first career was as a high school basketball coach, and I was a varsity basketball coach, a head coach at a young age in Indiana, and it was a really high level, like high school basketball, and Indiana is a really crazy basketball place. And as a young coach, I was really eager to get into like certain schemes. Like I wanted to run a certain offense, and I had all these ideas about what types of offensive plays we would run, and the scheme we would run, what kind of a press we would run on defense, and a lot of these like X's and O's basically is what I'm talking about. And I spent lots of time on that. I spent lots of time with the kids on that. I spent most of my reading and preparation for practice was about that, about the actual X's and O's, the actual schemes. But as I look back on those years, and a couple of them were kind of painful, I didn't do very well. I came to grow and get better, but I didn't spend enough time establishing the kind of like meaning about what does it mean to be a part of this team? It doesn't just mean that we run this motion offense that I want to run. Like that's not meaning. That's a mechanism for winning games. It's not the why we're doing it. So I did. So I think that you know, as I think back to that example, as our team did well at the beginning of the year, that everything was just fine. But as soon as we hit kind of bumps in the road, someone was injured, or we had a bad game, or we lost really badly, or people got mad at each other, which happens on every team. We didn't have a whole lot there, like in our foundation. We didn't have a lot to rely on. So that this developing of meaning of why we're here together, and what it means to be a part of this team is really foundational and more important than any scheme. So coaches need to connect their teams to meaning before deciding what people or what plays or what knowledge you connect them to. We connect them to what it means to be a part of this team in order to foster consistent, coherent action. So this is something that coaches, this next point here, have to make an initial and ongoing investment in this. So if we expect consistency at a collective level, we have to think early and often about how do we send cues about what it means to be a part of this team. Share some examples here in a moment. So just brokerage is not just about connections to people and resources, but to ideas and ways of interaction, ways of being together. That's some of the fundamental point of this meaning discussion. An example that I can think of regarding a coach or coaches connecting players or team members to meaning is in this book, which is probably a lot of people have read this book. It's a famous book called Legacy, and it focuses on this rugby team. I don't know anything about rugby. I'd never even heard of this team, but apparently they're the most successful team in the world. They're called the All Blacks in super successful historically over 100 years, the most successful rugby team. And it's a fascinating book to talk about not just these strategies that the coaches use, but the whole book is about meaning and culture, about how did the coaches really make clear examples of what they're all about, and that if you are on this team, what does that mean? It doesn't just mean that you win a lot of games or that you get famous and get rich and all these things. These guys did a great example of saying, well, if you're on this team, it means that you are, you put others first. If I'm on this team, I'm selfless. I put others before me. If I'm on this team, I am willing to make sacrifices. If I'm on this team, I do not cut corners. On any small things, big things, I do diligent work. That kind of thing, which sounds simple, but it's actually very complicated. So this is a part of brokering that's really important, I think. So that's the first aspect of the BEETZ model, and each aspect of the model relates to the others. So as you think about other elements of the model, these are not unrelated. These inform each other. They're related to each other. But as you reflect upon what brokering means, you might think about these questions as they relate to coaching. What are the key connections that need to be fostered to maximize your team's success? This could be players, a couple of key players that could be brought together. It could be a player and a coach. It could be a player and another resource person that could be of support. I'm not talking about connections among every player on a team. I'm talking about what are the really essential 2 or 3 connections that could really shape your team in a positive way. Another brokering question to reflect upon is, what advantages do individuals receive as a result of being part of your team? If the answer is just that they become better at swimming or soccer or tennis or golf or basketball or football, if that's the only advantage of being on your team, I would take that for granted. I would hope that every coach would feel that as a result of being on his or her team, those team members become better at their sport. That's a basic thing we aspire toward as coaches. But if that's it, like if that's all that we're kind of constructing everything about, we get stronger, faster, and better at throwing a ball. All right, that's a pretty limited benefit. That's a pretty limited advantage. So what are the other advantages that individuals get as a result of being on your team? And what evidence do you have to support that? Like what's being done to you may say, well, you're learning to become a better friend or a better citizen or a better father or a better parent. Well, what's the evidence? What is being done that supports that? Ultimately, you might say, well, as a coach, I'm held accountable for wins and losses. I'm held accountable for the public wants me to win games. Well, yes, that's true. But there's lots of research actually that shows that these things that we're talking about, these brokering practices, they actually are associated with better outcomes on a field or in competition. If you're engaging a whole person, you're helping them to be connected to things on and in and out of competition, positive things, it makes them better in competition. So they're not unrelated. They're not unrelated at all. They actually feed each other. So the last question that you could think about, a brokering question, is what does it mean to be a part of your team? Very broad question. What does it mean? Does it just mean you get all kinds of nice gear and you get to play on TV? Or is there, what else? What are the deeper things that you are connected to? What's the meaning that team members are connected to? So that's our discussion of brokering, and I appreciate your attention to it, and we'll continue with other aspects of the BEETZ model.